Hello and welcome back to BSG webinars. My name is Dan Carney, Graphic Design Manager at BSG, coming to you from my home office in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Thanks for joining us. This is our 18th episode and our fourth and final Humulus U episode. Normally we hold a one-day hop symposium in Yakima, Washington, but as everyone knows, we all have to take a break from getting together. So we decided we wanted to bring Humulus U to wherever you are. Before I introduce today's guests, I'd just like to remind everyone that all of our past webinars, including the 3 previous Humulus U episodes, are available on YouTube. You can just search BSG Craft in YouTube, and please, we ask that you subscribe. We have a lot of great content on there and plan on producing more. So, also, we'll be taking a break next week, but be sure to check back for more webinars to come. Those are located at bsgcraft.com/webinars, or going to bsgcraftbrewing.com and clicking on the webinar tile on our homepage. So now on to today's presentation. First, we ask that throughout the webinar that you please ask questions through the Q&A function center of the toolbar. After the presentation, we'll be opening up for a few questions. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest, Patty Aaron. Hi, Patty.
Am I mute? There we go. Hi, everybody. How's it going? I'm coming at you from my house today, and I'm going to give a talk here. I'm always a little challenged to figure this stuff out, but usually I get there. So, all right, here we go. Dan, can you see that?
Yep, you look good. I think we're ready to roll.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. This is going to be a talk about biotransformation and the effects of particular biotransformation reactions on hops and hop flavor. And so it's not all encompassing, but it's as comprehensive as I can make it for about 45 minutes to an hour, and talking about hops. So I'm going to try to get us through this right here. All right, here we go. See if it behaves. All right, so we'll go over biotransformation, the effect of yeast on hops, and the 4 main topics I'd like to cover today are going to be glycosidic cleavage, so release of glycosides and then therefore release of flavor compounds that were once bound to glucose molecules, terpenol transformation, organic acid conversion, which is exciting and a little bit newer, and then thiol release, which is always confusing for everybody. And then we'll give a little recap right there. All right, so what is biotransformation? It's really everything. And so when we take food in, when we eat something, our body biotransforms it. It goes through our metabolism, unless it goes directly into the bloodstream, and then it does become biotransformed eventually, but it maybe just targets a different area of the body. But it's a living organism reacting or engaging upon any molecule and transforming it or breaking it up or changing it or whatever it does, chew it up, spit it out. And it can be very, very subtle, as in the case of just a cleavage of a molecule, like in glycosidic cleavage. So sometimes that can be enzymatic, and sometimes that can be acidic or something else, or maybe heat related. And it can be very much more interesting, or rather more difficult to understand. Let's call it magical, which results in the expansion of the molecule. So the molecule actually changes shape or form, or even rearrangement of individual atoms into a new configuration. And sometimes we get things adding together, right? The result is the appearance of new aromas and flavors that maybe we could say were hidden. All right, what can yeast transform? When we look at the hop constituents, well, yeast can do a lot of things, and I'm not a yeast expert, but we'll talk about hops. We're going to look at the total resins. So within the resins themselves, we've got our alpha, beta acids, as well as a whole bunch of other things going on in there. Our essential oils, which we predominantly think about as these are our flavor compounds, flavor derivatives. And then we've got a cellulosic portion, which is what we would call the vegetative matter, so that leafy matter. And then we've got these other things going on, and we'll talk a little bit about the protein, very, very tiny, it's in the form of organic acids, really, so not quite protein, but close. And yeah, there's other things happening too, but we're going to skip that today. So what happens with hops is we split that up into our aqueous phase and our organic phase. And what's really interesting about this is we know in our organic phase, when we look at those essential oils and we look at the resins, we know that the essential oils have wonderful things in them as well as not so wonderful things in them sometimes as they begin to oxidize into other compounds. And the lipids, of course, those are things that can age quite badly. But when we look to the aqueous phase, that cellulosic phase and the glycosidic phase, and we can focus on polyphenols and the way polyphenols affect flavor in a different aspect. But today, not so much, right? We're going to focus on this vegetative matter and then the kind of the hidden secrets. And the thing about glycosides is they don't just exist in the aqueous phase. We do have evidence to say that they exist in the organic phase, but we're really not quite there and fully understanding it all. All right, so let's talk about hop glycosides. This is one of my most favorite people. I still talk to him on a very regular basis. He's pretty much my adopted dad, but he brought me to Miller and he is my mentor. So I'll get a big shout out to Dr. Patrick Ting. This is actually a picture of him taken in the old Miller lab, the lab that I worked in, that he brought me to in my prior life. And it was taken, I believe, the year I was born. So it's quite awesome. It's remarkable in many ways. Okay, so in 1998, Miller Brewing Company, as it was known at the time, they have a patent from 1998 that was assigned, and it outlined a method of preparing a full hop flavored beverage of low bitterness. And so this is really important because they were accentuating flavor within beers, but removing that bitterness component. And in that time, that's when light beers were becoming very, very light in flavor. When Miller Lite was first released, it was actually a little bit higher in BUs, closer to 25. And now, you know, it's below 10. So they were inching closer to these lower bitterness beers that had more hop flavor. The secret for this patent was glycosidic release of flavor compounds via the treatment of that vegetative material in the spent hop. So we call the spent hop material, or we call the vegetative matter rather, spent hop material, because when it goes through CO2 extraction, we extract out that organic phase and that aqueous phase, and we have our oils in the organic phase, and we have our alpha and beta acids, and that's what you can think of as a hop extract. Well, once we have our hop extract from CO2 extraction, we also have this vegetative material left over. And Miller actually put a patent on that material and used it in multiple ways. And you can read through a lot of their different patents if you want to know more about that. So yes, the authors went on to publish several further patents and eventually did report findings within the industry. Still quite a few secrets though. And their work represents some of the first literature that details the use of yeast biotransformation on hops and the effect of this on beer and beer flavor, light beer specifically. So here's a method of preparing a full hop flavored beverage of low bitterness. This was a light stable beer, hop flavored, fermented beverage of lower bitterness or less bitterness, and having comparable hoppy flavor to a beer prepared using whole hops, so not just extracts. So this is really interesting for many of us. And I'll just go back to that slide. This product was called Choice Debittered Hops. It was leaf that had been debittered by removing the alpha and beta acids in the oils. You can buy debittered leaf today, so this is something that is now available in the market. The patent's expired, and so that's something that you can use and play around with. All right, so a secret of hop flavor revealed. 1996, Miller found that the cellulosic portion after CO2 extraction contains a mixture of water-soluble molecules. So these are important because they're water-soluble. These molecules, such as linalool, which smells like lavender, is the predominant component of lavender, and it's also one of the predominant components of dry hop beers that are dry hop from Cascade and some other American varieties. They are attached to this glucose molecule, sugar molecule. And because they're attached to a sugar molecule, they are soluble in water. Awesome. So they're not volatile. So they don't get boiled off in the kettle, and they exist through fermentation. So this is an interesting patent. It is on hop leaves. The authors at Miller found that hop leaves could be used to give flavor to beer. This particular patent talks about grape flavor, a grape-like flavor. Now that grape-like flavor, don't think of Concord grape, think of like Sauvignon Blanc, more like that kind of catty, a little bit more catty, Concord-ish, but not so Concord, I guess, maybe desirable. And this is coming from a glycosidic release of some compounds in the hop leaves. All right, so glycosides, what's the secret? You can see those scissors there on the right of the screen, and we've got the cleavage of that molecule. So we've got a linalool here, a terpenol, and a glycoside next to it. Yeast can hydrolyze beta glycosides and further convert the aglycone, so this just means the sugar's been removed, into hop flavor. The activity varies by yeast strain, and non-Saccharomyces tend to be best at cleaving inter-sugar bonds. I've got some references down there. You'll have access to this presentation, you can look those up. I also did write a kind of semi-review article that's launched toward or geared toward small brewers, craft brewers, and if someone emails me, or I'll have maybe Dan share that if you have interest in reading that article. It's in Brew Your Own, and it explains a little bit more of this selectivity in chemistry. But there's enzymatic release, 1,4-beta-D glucosidases. These are exo-beta-glucanases. They may play a role here. And the beta-glycosides present in this hop cellulose portion are thought to contribute rather to what we would say is kettle hop flavor in beer. Traditionally, we think of this kettle hop flavor coming from noble hop varieties as being the result of oxidated sesquiterpenes, and that's that kind of woody noble hop, a little bit, maybe a little earthy, spicy flavor. And we believe that some of that flavor is also coming from these glycosides. Now, what we know is that the aglycone, so this is the part of the molecule that does not have the sugar's been released, cleaved, are representative of all of the fractions that you might find in hops. So that would be the sulfur-containing compounds, hop oil fraction compounds, and then their oxidative or oxidized derivatives. Awesome. Oh, hey. I had to change this presentation to a format, and so I apologize for the large, bold typeface on the right side. I tried to clean it all up, but sometimes these things escape me. All right, so this, the couple studies, Luke Dannon, he did his PhD in Belgium. He screens several Saccharomyces and Brettanomyces for their hydrolase activities. A few of the Saccharomyces strains that they monitored were shown to have activity. However, Brettanomyces custeri, a lambic type strain, possess high exo-beta-glucanase activity. So, predominant components that they measured released from glycosidically bound aroma precursors here are those that you would see represented in the typical organic fraction, in the hop oil fraction. And then we've got some oxidized derivatives down at the bottom, and so on and so forth. So lots of good compounds here. We've got the S and the R linalool. They are similar in aroma, but one of them is much more pungent than the other. And then we've got our terpenols, uranyl, nerol, citronella, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And what's interesting here, vanillin, and these benzyl alcohol. So benzyl alcohol, that might be reminiscent of like a cherry flavor, maybe like a candy cherry flavor, things like that, or an apple type flavor. All right, so further studies were done on specific hop cultivars. This is done by researchers from Oregon State University. So Daniel Sharp, from his dissertation, you can Google that and look that up. He looked at Citra, Simcoe, Centennial, and Cascade. And then Tatiana Pratt, she works for in the industry today for CalSAC. She did her PhD in Belgium as well. And she looked at specific German and Japanese varieties with her fellow colleagues. Glycosidic hydrolysis could be more active at the end of fermentation. This is believed to be due to the fact that the yeast are getting hungry. So I know that Patrick always said, oh, the yeast are so hungry, we got to feed them more. They are going to eat all the glycosidic compounds. And so this is just a theory, but it probably holds true. It could be more yeast strain dependent, but if the yeast are under nutritional stress, why not? If they can grab a glucose molecule and spit out an aroma compound that they don't care about, cool. All right, so the glycosides make it into beer, can be enzymatically hydrolyzed in your mouth as well. So not saying that you should put spent hop material in your mouth, but you could, and maybe you would retronasally smell these compounds. Conclusion on glycosides. Well, there's still a lot more work to be done, and it seems like there's been a bit of a pause on this work, more focus now on thiols today. What the literature tells us is that the addition of hop cones, pellets, as well as that debittered leaf or vegetative fraction to wort and beer can lead to an increase in available hoppy flavor, more than we even thought from just the components that we can measure. The impact of this potential is largely up to hop variety and ultimately the majesty of the yeast. So what type of yeast is it? Its capability to cleave, spit out different enzymes, how healthy it is, and the amount of time that it sits in contact with the hops. All right, so we're going to move on to terpenol transformation. Okay, so terpenols, generally we find these in the essential oil fraction. Some of them can be bound, as we saw before, in the cellulosic portion as glycosides, but we're going to talk about these components as they exist in the hop oil fraction. The hop oil fraction, we call this a volatile fraction. It will vary by varietal type, growing region, agricultural practices, drying, kilning practices, so many different things, right? Even potentially milling practices and pelletization. I see I have a question. I'm just going to click on it. Haha, it's anonymous. All right, we'll get back to that. Use of exogenous enzymes. So we look at the predominant compounds. The predominant compounds are actually the hydrocarbons. Those are the monoterpenes. Myrcene is the predominant aroma compound in all hops. And then we have our sesquiterpenes. Wow, talking is hard today. Beta-caryophyllene, farnesene, and humulene. So these are your kind of woody, kind of earthy, carroty, hop-smelling like compounds. And those are often associated with like a noble type kettle hop flavor once they become oxidized. So we also have the aliphatic hydrocarbons. A lot of these really don't make it into the beer because they're so volatile. But what happens to myrcene is generally it gets boiled off in the kettle, and then those other compounds in the sesquiterpenes, they become oxygenated or oxidated, whatever you want to call it. So that's fraction 2. Once they become oxygenated, and this can happen in the hop as well as in the kettle, you get your terpene alcohols like linalool, geraniol, nerol, alpha terpenol, sesquiterpene alcohols like humulinols, and then you've got this whole other plethora of compounds. Your aldehydes, some are interesting and fruity, some not so much. You've got some acids that we'll talk about, esters, epoxides, things like hexanal, very grassy, nonanal, which is not very yummy. It's kind of a little stinky, maybe potato-y kind of compound. And then you've got things like 3-methylbutanoic acid, not very yummy. Geranyl acetate is actually quite nice, and caryophyllene oxide is very carrot earthy, very, very nice. And then we've got these sulfur-containing compounds, and we'll focus on those a little bit later. Okay, next slide. Here we go. So within the hop oil fraction, about 80% of the fraction hop oil fraction exists as terpenes. And then what's interesting, and we'll talk about this, is the sulfur compounds exist in a much lower amount, 0.1%. Glycosides, we don't really know. We have some data, but it's older now, and it's only on a few varieties. This is a really interesting book. If you can get your hands on it, it's hard to find. Hops, their cultivation, composition, and usage. Bravo. This is from Cynthia Amalgar's paper. She did her PhD in Germany, and this paper is a great paper if you want to review all the things that we know that are in hops. And so obviously you probably can't see all those compounds, But if you do grab that paper, you'll be able to read all the fine little print here. But what we know is there are more than 1,000 compounds that have been identified. We believe 70% of them are hydrocarbons, and the other 30% are probably oxygenated or oxidized compounds. All right, so let's focus on these floral, citrus, aroma, active monoterpenes, and terpene alcohols. So we've got myrcene, we talked about that, that's very piney. Linalool, lavender, nerol, it's like lemongrass, geraniol, roses or some other types of flowers, citronellol, and then terpenol, piney. These are correlated with all those different flavors, aromas, or all aromas rather, and they have thresholds at the part per billion level. Nerol and geraniol, you can see that you've got that alcohol fraction circled. They are actually isomers of each other. One's got an arm that points down and one's got an arm that's saying hello, right? So that's the only difference. And they're largely planar molecules. They can twist a little bit, but really one's just hanging out down, yep, chilling, and the other one's saying hi. So of those two, we'll talk about this in a minute, they can interchange, and yeast can actually work on nerol and geraniol and transform them back from one another. We consider geraniol and linalool to be the highest impact of this class of compounds. A lot of work coming out of Max Steinzer's lab and then followed up with by Val Peacock, focused on linalool and the explanation of linalool being the predominant kind of fresh hoppy aroma that we see in dry hopped beer, right? So here's just a slide showing all these different varieties. The variety name is on the left. This is some older data at this point. But looking at the different varieties, we can see that linalool is in this turquoisey bar. Hopefully it's turquoise on your slide. And we've got some varieties that are super, super high in linalool. Nugget, for example, Citra. Cascade generally is pretty high, but these ones are not showing as high. And then we've got some experimental varieties and some Hallertau varieties. And then these stars, the stars that I put stars on, hopefully they're correlated and lined up, even though I switched out my slides a little bit. That blue bar is geraniol, and geraniol is really interesting and important because what happens during fermentation, well, you can see my slide here because, oops, right? What happens here during fermentation, I can't see my own title, but I'm pretty confident it says fermentation at the top. If you look at linalool, which is the green star on the left side in wort, you can see that after fermentation, main fermentation of 3 days, main fermentation and secondary fermentation, and I do have, I'm so sorry that, not sure if you can see this reference, but it is there. I believe this is Takoi's work, but I will double check that. I believe it's out of Japan. And at the end of storage, after secondary fermentation, we see this augment, increase, boost in linalool. What's interesting is that geraniol, the yellow stars, the cool yellow stars here, very important. Geraniol levels can start very high and then decrease. And then throughout fermentation, we remain quite steady. And then by the end of storage, they go back up. Well, the explanation for this is biotransformation. So yeast can take in geraniol or nerol and convert them into different components. So we see here that geraniol, citronellol, and nerol are very, very similar compounds. Geraniol and nerol, of course, are isomeric, which means they have the same number of carbons, they have the same number of atoms, the same, if you were to write out their molecular formula, very same. It is the same, that's a nice word, just a different shape, right? One's waving hello, one's sitting cool with his hand on his hip. And then we go to citronellol, where seemingly we've lost one double bond here. So we've had a little bit of an addition of hydrogens. And then we've got linalool here, which has an oxygen on it, and so on and so forth. And what we can see from this work, which is Turcoy's work, and then republished by Tatiana, and then also looked at by King and Dickinson early on. King and Dickinson had some really interesting early thoughts on biotransformation, that yeast are taking in geraniol, making linalool, making citronellol. Nerol is being reconverted back to geraniol, also being converted to linalool. Nerol is also being converted into alpha terpenol. Okay, this is, I mentioned this earlier. These compounds on the right are both the same compound. They are both linalool, and we've got S versus R. And so what that means at the top is that now we've got, like, just imagine that this person is wearing like earphones, and on one side there's a C and one side there's an H. Well, one of them is wearing them backwards, and that's really the only difference. So instead of having the carbon on my right ear, I'm having it on my left ear. And what we know is that these have different odor thresholds. So we have S, which is sweet, odor threshold of 7.4 part per billion, and then we've got the R configuration, which is woody lavender, and it has a much lower configuration. I just threw that in there because it's really interesting information. But what happens during biotransformation is you might wind up with different stereoisomers of this compound. All right, this is just a depiction saying, hey, we can glycosidically cleave geraniol during fermentation, and then geraniol can become linalool or terpenol or citronellol. So just a reminder that geraniol exists in glycosidic form as well as esteric form, and then glycosidically bound. Cool. So here's just another depiction of geraniol biotransformation to esters. So we've got geraniol transforming into geranyl acetate. So it's got a couple more atoms attached to it, some oxygens, and then that therefore converting into citronellyl acetate. We can also convert geraniol to citronellol, we saw that before, and then citronellol can convert into citronellyl acetate. So while the predominant pathway for ester production relies on amino acid metabolism in this model, think isoamyl acetate to banana kind of, yeast can secondarily metabolize free aglycans, so that those are these compounds that don't have glucose attached to them, into acetate esters, and these can have very strong fruity aromas. Awesome. And that, I don't know if you guys read that down there, but yeast can hydrolyze geranyl esters into geraniol. I just said that on the last slide, but just a reminder. And this is from Peacock and Deinzer, 1981. Awesome. All right, so we know that geraniol content can vary by variety. Even if oil content varies, we've got geraniol by percentage varying here, going through the whole spectrum. And so what we can therefore predict is that if we look at the geraniol content of specific varieties, if it's very high in geraniol, that might be predictive of a very high linalool, citrusy, kind of fruity flavor in your beer. All right, just another slide here. Cascade tends to be high in geranyl esters, and there's so much potential there, and that's all made available by yeast biotransformation. So take the stacking here of these different components. We've got geraniol, which is an aldehyde, geranyl acetate, geranyl propionate, geranyl isobutyrate. We call this geraniol potential. So you add up all of those molecules, hop variety A, B, C, and D across the top, and then we have what's called a geraniol potential number here. So variety D, even though it has just 68, we'll say 68 part per billion of geraniol, if you add up all the other components, it has the potential to have a much higher impact on fruity citrus character. Cool. All right, so conclusion from terpenol release, geraniol is thought to be king. There hasn't been a lot of recent work done. If you go back to that Tokoi paper's 2010, and then Nils Rutberg's paper 2014, and Christina Schoenberger presented some newer data in 2015. So I'm not sure how much more has been done on this, but what we know is cultivar specific, North American varietals and European varietals grown in North America. So that's European varieties that have been grown in North America tend to be higher. So we have a geographic effect as well as a cultivar effect. The varieties that we know are high in free geraniol are Mosaic, Bravo, Chinook, Citra, Amarillo, Galena, Warrior, and high in bound geraniol varieties tend to be some of these German varieties. Again, most recent work has been coming out of Germany, so we don't have all the data that we maybe want to have. But in the US, Summit is also a variety that's kind of like a little sneaker variety. If you want a really citrusy flavor, Summit, let it go through fermentation, and you might see some surprising citrusy flavors. All right, we need more work done on that. For further research, this is Tatiana's paper. It is a wonderful paper. You can go ahead and look that up and do some further reading. All right, organic acid conversion. This is really interesting for me because many, many years ago, I read, and I still have it's a Zimmergy magazine from, I don't know, 80s, 70s, talked about organic acids and hops. And there really I haven't seen any new work on it. So there's been some recent work done. And Patrick and I always had these theories about organic acids. And I know that Tom's talked about it a little bit, Tom Shellhammer, that is. And so now there's maybe some new work coming toward it. And we'll take a look at that. We're going to look at the soft resins, cellulosic portion, and keep moving. Okay, so lupulin, we break lupulin into the resins and hop oil fraction. So basically, we get our resins, which are alpha, beta, gamma, delta, all those resins that no one's ever heard of, but have been discovered every once in a while. And then we've got our hop oils, and so we fragment that off. Lupulin maïehouse is really just your whole oil fraction for 20 to 30% of your cone weight. And then we break those resins down into hard resins, soft resins. And once we get into the soft resins here, that's what we're usually more interested in, although there's some evidence to say that there's some brewing value with hard resins. And I'm not really sure if anyone wants to spend that much time brewing with them, but xanthocumol was of interest for a very long time. I think still is as a natural product as well as a natural flavor stabilizer. But you can see we've got these, epsilon, gamma, delta, all these different fractions. Anyway, so we're going to focus on alpha and beta. The alpha acids we're all pretty familiar. There are 3 predominant analogs. There are actually other analogs that we don't talk much about, but the humulone, cohumulone, the adhumulone are most interesting for us because they are predominant bittering precursors. We also have the beta fraction. Beta acids are receiving a little bit more attention. I did give a talk yesterday on haze, and there's some wonderful evidence to show that beta acids can be great promoters of haze. Similar analogs as alpha, and then we've got this uncharacterized fraction. All right, coming back to our alphas and our betas, these 2 sets here, what can happen is they can break down, their side chains can break down into organic acids and then form esters. And let me get back on the slide here. Okay, so during hop storage, branched chain fatty acids can increase as hops age due to the breakdown of these hop acid side chains. And this is predominantly if you look at the R group, we call this the R group, it's the group coming off of the main ring in our alpha acids and in our beta acids. This R group here varies by molecule. So humulin, cohumulin, adhumulin, they have different chain lengths. And those result in isovaleric, isobutyric, 2-methylbutyric, and then I threw in prehumulone and posthumulone because they're interesting. Not a lot of those in the hops themselves, but we do find them, and we've got isohexanoic and isopropanoic just to go on. These aren't really great smelling compounds. So isovaleric is cheesy. So good. Isobutyric is kind of like baby vomit. 2-methylbutyric is like rotting fruit, maybe a little goaty, and then so on and so forth. Not wonderful compounds. However, once these organic acids esterify, they can become these wonderful, fruity, pineapple-y, citrusy, estery compounds. So we have esters, and the esters have these keto, and then this O group here. During fermentation, yeast can also convert these acids, right? So they convert them from the organic acid, from our rancid Parmesan, into our fruity estery compounds. Ethyl isobutyrate, ethyl isovalerate, ethyl 2-methylbutyrate, so on and so forth. These ethyl esters from hop short chain fatty acids have been associated with citrus character, even by a variety such as SOTs. So a lot of you who are familiar with SOTs, right, it's maybe a noble heritage landrace variety. And that is the predominant hop from the Czech Republic. And it makes great Pilsner, but you never really think about it as being citrusy. Well, have you taken some SOTs hops and aged them and then put them through fermentation? You might be surprised. All right, so this is some work from my past, not published. A lot of the work that I did in my past was not published, but more presented in presentations, and there's as well as reports. And in the Miller basement of where I used to work, there was this whole archive section that was filled with amazing material that no one could ever find or see unless you worked there. So what was happening is we had an issue with an off flavor in a product that we were making, and we wanted to understand where it was coming from. So did the work, and what we found was that because we were using ethanol in the processing of hop oils, or hop oil fraction rather, and purified alpha, beta fractions, things like that, we were creating all of these fruity ester components that gave a predominant note of fruity, cherry, borderline kind of vomity, depending on how much of the acid form was still in there. So what was happening was those side chains were either already broken down or breaking down due to heat induction. And then the ethanol was esterifying these compounds and making them fruity. And so you can kind of see that the notes here: pungent black cherry, blueberry, fruity, apple pie, apple skins, and then we've got cheesy dirty socks. Well, these are associated with the compounds. So isobutyric acid, not so great. Maybe think like, it's like a waxy appley, maybe like a bug, if you squish a bug, kind of smells like that sometimes, like an ant. And then we've got these wonderful fruity flavors. Well, the whole point of that project was to remove those fruity flavors because we didn't actually want them in some of the beers that we were producing, but we wanted to understand where they were coming from. And the takeaway for, I guess, all of you and in industry is that if you're able to age hops and the side chains of the hop acids, betas, as well as alphas, rather, start breaking down, or you add heat, and then you introduce that into either fermentation, so activity of yeast, or in the presence of ethanol, then you can have these really interesting flavors. All right, so this is the most recent work by Thiol, super, super interesting, looking at hops as well as malts and the effect of their fatty acids on flavor potential. So we talked about these molecules already, isobutyl, isobutyrate, so on and so forth. These are coming from the esterification, the joining of different fragments of the hop side chains. And what we find was these isobutyric, isovaleric, 2-methylbutyric acid is that we have these esters forming, some of them coming from malts, and some predominantly from hops. And it seems like isovaleric is the predominant, most impactful effect on creating this very fruity ethyl isovalerate flavor. And if we look at that compound, isovaleric, going back, so isovaleric is coming from Humulus, right? Awesome, it's cool. All right, hop-derived organic acids. This is the summary. Yeast can hydrolyze ethyl esters into their subunits, which are organic acids and terpene alcohols. I guess I didn't really talk about that too much in the last slide, but hop acid side chains can be released. When we get those organic acids, they can then become converted into esters from malt, but also from hops. Isovaleric seeming to be the most impactful. And this means that low levels of fatty acids, even if they're there, are present, right? They can also potentially enhance the flavor impact of terpenols. And that is actually coming from Takoi's paper, where he talks about that in the end. If you had just a little bit of fatty acid in there, then the flavor profile of that fruity character can be increased. We call that a synergy, a synergistic effect. All right, last but not least, thiols. All right, generally, we talk about thiols coming from the cellulosic material as well as the glycosidic material, although you will find them in other parts of the hops. But the research is still limited because the extraction is complicated and the analysis is complicated, and we never really quite know if we are making these compounds when we're extracting things, or if we're not picking up all of the molecules, because the detection of them can be quite challenging because they exist at such low levels. But we'll go through what we know. So we call them polyfunctional thiols. That means that they contain a sulfur group. So we say R is a side group that has SH on it. So we have a molecule with a sulfuryl hydryl group on it. These compounds can undergo hydrolysis, they can be reduced, and they can be esterified and exist in the form of a cysteine adduct or a thiol conjugate. So basically they're bound to another molecule, making the bigger molecule, or conjugated with another molecule. They are responsible for some very positive flavors like citrus, lemon, grapefruit, all that, lychee, mango, Sauvignon Blanc, and we all know Citra, which was formerly called HBC 394. Very, very Sauvignon Blanc, very kind of catty, tropical. And they exist at part per trillion levels. So they're so low and they have such low thresholds that they can be challenging to analyze. And they can exist in many different chemical forms. And we're just still kind of getting there. So the earlier work by Kishimoto in 2009, he detected 7 hop-derived odorant thiols. And so this is really the basis of some of the work coming out, understanding what that catty aroma is that makes cascade, and what those compounds in varieties like Citra are that make them so special. All right, so for MMP, we'll just shorten it up, and 3MH and 3MHA. 3MHA can come from malts. So there's some new work coming out of France that focuses on thiols coming out of malt. Very, very interesting. But these compounds are responsible for the very citrus-like components. Often we don't see 4-MMP free, so it's existing freely, not bound in the hops, in European hops, and we believe that's due to, could be genetic, but we do know that growing European hops in the US seems to have an effect, and so therefore there's also this environment effect. So we've got G, we've got E, all the effects. 2012, another paper coming out of France, found 41 polyfunctional thiols among 5 cultivars, looking at Tomahawk, Croissant Savon, Nuggets, Cascade, and South. Awesome. So for MMP, like I said earlier, this is said to be responsible for the predominant note of US varieties such as Simcoe, Summit, Apollo, and Cascade. And so we see these graphics on the right, intensities of black currant-like flavor. So this is that kind of catty black currant-like flavor. analyzed by sensory. So you see Simcoe, Summit, Apollo, Cascade, a very high impact. This is sensorily. So people smelled them. They said, oh, this smells like blackcurrant. And then we also see that the total hop aroma seems to be driven by this intensity, and then correlated that to 4 mmP in these hops, right? So more work coming out of France here, quite a few papers all combined, but there can be good and bad flavors coming out of thiols, and this is due to the distance between the sulfothiols group and then the alcohol group. So the number of carbons in between tends to give us either good or bad. So roughly 4 carbons or less, then we get these thiols that are maybe not desirable unless you're producing bread or cooking mushrooms or roasting meat. Then actually they're really desirable, but maybe not so much in your beer. And then these 5 carbons give you exotic tropical fruit, really lovely flavors that we tend to desire in hops. All right. So the early work identified free polyfunctional thiols in hops. That means they were just existing in the hops themselves, maybe existing in the beer. They weren't bound to anything. And we know that each variety displays different impact from their thiols at varying quantities. Tomahawk, for example, has a very citrus, floral, grapefruit, and blackcurrant-like note from its free thiols, while Nugget seems to be mostly just lemon. So that's interesting. Nugget can be kind of lemony, and then we also know that it can be citrusy from some of the earlier information we showed. And then we've got Cascade and Nelson Sauvin somewhere meeting in between. But this is interesting, Tomahawk itself, because we don't think of Tomahawk as being a very citrusy type hop in general, more of a bittering hop. It can have great citrus and floral potential. Now we have this thing called bound thiols, bound polyfunctional thiols. So this means that the thiols are existing in the hops, but they're bound to another compound. So they're not necessarily volatile and they need to be released. Now, if they exist in the form of a cysteine conjugate, this is a cysteine conjugate, then that is a protein, and that can be broken. The bond can be broken, like in the glycosidic release that we saw earlier, and then the thiols can become free. So these researchers looked at the free versus the cysteinylated components of some predominant thiols that we know we can measure. So we've got grapefruit, rhubarb, passion fruit. We see some varieties like Cascade are very high in free passion fruit type rhubarb kind of flavor. And then we see that they also have more potential in them where those compounds are hidden by being bound. Now look at this Sriracha Ace. So this is like a diamond in disguise, right? If you want that grapefruit, passion fruit, tropical, then Sriracha Ace, well, maybe dry hopping with it isn't going to give you much, but wow, look at that potential bound up in there. And then Citra as well. Citra has some, and a little bump for Nelson. And then we move on to the grapefruit type note. So little bump here for Mosaic, Nelson Sauvin, and then this Caddy black currant. Wow, Nelson Sauvin doesn't have a lot of free thiol, but yes, it does seem to have a lot of bound. And we don't have a lot of data on all these varieties, but we know, what we know is that different varieties have different potentials. And some of the thiols that are bound in the form of a cysteine conjugate, or also this new glutathione S conjugate as of 2018. So I guess not so new anymore. This is CC's work. She presented 2018 at the conference. We see that we have certain fruity, citrusy characters like this G3S-POL. We'll just call it orangey, tangerine kind of. If we look across the varieties that were analyzed here, Amarillo, Hallertau Blanc, well, Citra is very, very high here, right? So we're like, wow, that's probably driving the Citra aroma in Citra. But then if we look for these other compounds, so that's the let me take a step back here because I don't think I explained that really well. So we've got 3-SPOL. We've got free form. I could probably not point my finger, then you can see the free form on the top, the cysteinated, and then the glutathione related. All right, so I got to change my story because you guys are probably like, what? Hey, okay. So if you look at the free amount of this tangerine kind of flavor, and we look at a variety such as Citra, so let's go back. Not a lot of free, not a lot of cysteinated, but bound to glutathione as an S conjugate, thiol conjugate, we see this huge potential. So that means that Citra, if it goes through fermentation, can release a lot of this character. So free versus bound, we kind of see that happening. All right, so that's the way we look at these compounds. And then we look at another set of compounds, this kind of rhubarby or passion fruit, grapefruit character. We see the same thing. So maybe not so much free is available, but really, really high in a bound form. Another variety, this is an interesting variety, and I'd love to see more beers use this, Polaris. So Polaris is sometimes it gives you kind of like a minty herbal earthy note. It's not really known to be super fruity, and that's because it doesn't have a lot of free thiols. So you would never think to say, oh, I'm going to dry hop with Polaris because you're like, well, it doesn't really smell like that. But if it goes through fermentation, what we see is it's got huge potential to be citrusy, right? Okay, awesome. So how do we optimize the utilization of these bound forms in late or in dry hopping? And what you can do is you can focus on some hop varieties, blending them together so that you get some of the free forms and you get some of the bound forms if you're going to do some late hopping in the kettle so it can go through fermentation, and then dry hopping, right? And in dry hopping, we know we get a lot of those floral kind of citrus flavors coming from the monoterpenes. So maybe you marry those together and you get your high impact. So if we're looking at the pleasant bound thiols for late kettle hopping varieties here, so these go through biotransformation, they go through fermentation. Look at Amarillo, Citra, Hallertau Blanc, Sriracha Ace, Nelson Sauvon. I've heard really interesting stories about Sriracha Ace going through fermentation. And then we look at dry hopping, for example, free thiols, maybe focus on Citra, Mosaic, and Hallertau Blanc. But do you want all of those flavors to come from dry hopping when we know the potential in there is to be released? Well, you could do some bottle aging. You could do, so you could do your final carbonation rather, right, in the bottle. Some of these could be released from the yeast in there, or maybe in sour beers, things like that, using Brettanomyces or other yeast strains. All right, if you want to do some further reading on thiols, here is a great paper. Awesome, awesome, coming out of France. And here's the summary. Thiols exist as free and bound forms. The amount of thiols resulting in your beer depends on whether the yeast can have their way with the hops to release more bound forms during fermentation, or if they have contact time during dry hopping. Sriracha Ace, for example, is very high in these bound compounds, but not so high in a free form. So what does that mean? Well, if you want to get grapefruit, rhubarb, passion fruit from Sriracha Ace, it needs to have some interaction with yeast in a prolonged manner, right? So it probably needs to go through fermentation. And now remember, if we go back to our chemistry, these bound forms are water soluble. So they are compounds that are bound, that are going to be extracted in your wort and make their way through the kettle into fermentation because they will not be volatilized. Now your free thiols during the kettle will volatilize, right? So it's this balance, it's this dance. You want to increase citrus, lemon, and grapefruit notes in Citra. Its conjugates of glutathione must be released. So maybe you don't just dry hop with Citra, maybe you throw some in Whirlpool, or maybe you throw some in during active fermentation, right? Yeah, we could try play around with that a little bit. German variety Polaris, interesting. Probably a lot of you never knew that you could get those grapefruit, passion fruit flavors. And there's so much more to learn. We don't know it all. We just know that we have a lot more to learn. we never really know everything, but some things such as the application of pesticides, especially those that contain copper. Copper is very reactive to sulfur, and that can remove some of those compounds. So we believe that some of the agricultural practices in different areas of the world where we grow hops could limit the thiol potential of the hops. All right, so here's our conclusion, our takeaway. We did it. Congratulations to me for keeping it under an hour, because I could talk about this stuff all day. Biotransformation, yeast can do it, and so can you. Yeast can biotransform hops to release glycosides, and they can also behave well on geraniol and linalool to transform terpenols and make your beer even more fruity and citrusy than you thought. They can act on organic acids, and they can release thiols as well as other compounds. Thank you all so much. This is a picture of my last vacation before COVID. I was down in Baja, Mexico, and on the beach, and it was really, really great. I'd like to be there now. So that's it. That's all I got for you. I guess I'll open it up to more questions, and I'll let Dan take control because I don't know how to move anything around. Start my video. Okay, there I am. Oh, could you not see me during my talk? I was doing all kinds of things with my hands and making molecules, and so if you missed some of the stereochemistry lessons by shapes in my body, yeah, too bad.
No, thank you. That was a very intense scientific lesson that we all just got. So you did have that question that came through. So I don't know if you want to start with that one.
What are your thoughts on the use of exogenous glycosidase enzymes during dry hopping? Dangerous. I mean, challenging, because you want to make sure your enzymatic activity is kind of finished, because you're not just releasing specific flavor compounds. You could be acting on other things. You just don't want a lot of enzymatic activity remaining there if you're going to package your beer. So that's a tricky situation. It's really up to what you're going to do with the beer afterwards, I think. But there's been some interest in treating hops, and this does happen in wine. You can treat wine grapes with these enzymes and release more of the potential. But wine's not carbonated. We don't put it in a can that can explode. So you want to just be really careful about what you're cleaving off, and if there's residual things in there that can ferment, and we don't need exploding cans. Oh, how are hop CFAs adapting to the evolution of hop science? Well, what type of information should we be looking for or asking about? I think it's really interesting because when we look at a hop CFA versus a malt CFA, we get so much information off the malt CFA. You can actually use, if you're savvy, you can use the malt CFA to help you understand how to mill your grain properly, if you might need a rest in the mash, or you might need to add enzymes, or but our hop CFAs don't tell us much, and the challenge is that we have harvest, everything has to happen really quickly. We take our numbers and we do some analyses. Some of the analyses we do don't give us very useful information. Like, we know total oils. I think total oils is useful, but the work coming out of Oregon State done by Dan Bolmer and Tom Shellhammer, and then some other colleagues in their lab, shows us that it's not just the total oil, it's the quality, and the quality can vary, and your hop CFA isn't going to tell you that. No, I'm not going to say, hey, we want to give everybody all the information we can possibly get. I know that at BSG, we're working on building our lab capabilities. We started building the lab out in February, and due to COVID, I haven't been able to go back to finish it. But our hope is to at least get you that hop oil information on your CFA. That said, I'm assuming there are no kids down here because I like to swear and I always just swear, but we boil the shit out of the hop oil, the hop pellets or the hop cones to get the oils out of it. So if you think about it, it's representative of hops that have gone through a very long extracted boil in the kettle. And that's what it tells you. It doesn't tell you what's there for, dry hopping potential or so on and so forth. And so the numbers can be really challenging to read and use. And I think there's been some talk about developing a newer method that extracts out just those components without it going through a heat source and doing analysis. But then that would require more work, more instrumentation. It's hard to get things to harvest, so not making promises. But yeah, that C of A, it's just not good enough, is it?
We're getting there.
Any research on crop year? Are you reading these, Dan, or do you want me to read them?
Either way, that's fine. I'll probably mispronounce some words if.
Well, I did that. I do it all the time. Okay. Crop year thiol variation. There is some, but the amount of data we have available is really limited. I think that you go to Sonia Collins' group. They've done the most research on it in terms of looking at crop year. And I know that there's some German groups now working, competitors of ours, who have been collecting a lot more information. We are really working as part of the Hop Research Council, and in conjunction with the BA, we're really working to have thiol analysis in North America. We currently don't have that capability. So we're trying to get that capability so that we can do more research because we know it's important. Okay, probably didn't answer your question, but so do you have an opinion, or is there research on how much contact time one would need on the hot side to capture the compounds from the hops? For example, the difference between a hop pellet addition to the whirlpool, which would have more contact time, compared to running the wort through a hop back. Well, I like the hop. I mean, either of those are going to work, but I like the addition to the whirlpool because you have, this is just my opinion, I guess what you're asking for my opinion, because you have some momentum in there, and you also have, it's very hot, and you're coming into this place where the pellets are going to be able to really expand and open up in a way that maybe not during the hop back, but I don't know what your hop back situation is, and so you may have a way around that where your pellets are very exposed. I don't know. I haven't seen any research on how long they sit in there. I've seen enough research on dry hopping to know that we actually should be dry hopping a lot less in time, shorter time, than most people are, because you're actually not getting anything out of it. Not sure that answered your question, but anecdotally, right. Hi, Mike.
Vinny added, I should have added whole cones in the hop back.
Yeah, okay, so I've had some conversations. Sorry, I'm skipping Mike's question for a second. I've had some conversations with other people. I don't want to say all their names because maybe some people want to keep those secrets. I don't know. The difference between whole cones and pellets. We don't know enough. I would say if you are trying to extract the compounds that are bound and they're in the vegetative material, you're not going to be able to extract as much out of a whole cone. However, it depends on how that whole cone is going through your whole process. So if it's just a hot back where you're running hot work through on the way to the heat exchanger, maybe not enough contact time. But if you're recircing, like some of our bigger craft brewers go through dynamic dry hopping, and they are using whole cones, okay, right? So we all know who that is, but then you get that increased impact because you're breaking everything up and you're extracting more from the lupulin, and that's kind of the idea. But that's just a theory. I'm going to go back to Mike's question.
Sure.
I've read opinions that vigorous CO2 production during fermentation, e.g. too warm, can potentially strip some of these more aromatic compounds from the beer and especially impact thiols, which are present in such small quantities. Do you have an opinion? Yes. This can absolutely happen. I've had lots of conversations about this CO2 stripping of volatiles, and some experience in large production working on how to use CO2 with intention to scrub aroma compounds. So there's actually equipment you can install in your fermenters if you want to do that and make a very clean lager, light lager. So we know that that's absolutely a thing. And yes, it can happen. I'm not entirely sure how to minimize that, but it's going to come down to tank geometry as well as the rate of the CO2 coming out. You don't ever want it to be super vigorous, I don't think. However, if you do have hops in there, that vigorous CO2 can help break up the hops. You want to minimize your headspace. And, you know, you're going to have foam on the top of the fermenter. So it really depends. I think it's going to depend on the geometry of your tanks and then the systems you've got in place. If you've got open fermenters, yeah, you'll probably lose a lot of those styles. But those styles of beers generally aren't thiol forward. Can you talk a bit more about the aged sots? Okay, well, age any hops really. But what I was referring to with sots is it's a variety really known to be linalool kind of forward, kind of woody forward. And it's a variety known to impart, I like to call it like, it's like a cross between a licorice and a blueberry kind of fake flavor. It's just like a spicy noble character, which I don't really know what to call it otherwise, but that's generally what you get from a sots that goes, you know, that's been used traditionally. But that research that came out, if you age the sots, then you get these other qualities. Well, you can get that with any variety of hops. If you've done any lambic beer brewing or, you know, you've used aged hops, you know that they really stink, they're really cheesy, but the cheesy note doesn't necessarily get conveyed into the beer, because if those organic acids have prolonged contact with microorganisms, not just yeast, but other microorganisms that can esterify them, and then also they have contact with ethanol, which is often the case in like a lambic style beer, already has ethanol in it. They use aged hops, and part of that was they didn't want the bitterness component of those hops. Another part of it is it gives a really fruity character. A lot of those you know, traditional lambic styles of beer have a lot of fruit, also a lot of maybe other mousy kind of, you know, characters. And then you do get some protective, a little bit of protection from your hops. And some people have asked about, can you use hops to give you antibacterial static, antibacterial effect in a beer like or a product like a seltzer? And I say, yeah, use some aged hops. You know, you only need 2 parts per million of these acids, like the alpha acids, beta acids, or whatever they may be, and beta acids are very effective. If you can get that into your beer, then, you know, a lot of the alpha acids are broken down, maybe not so bitter. Okay, I don't know if we answered that question well, but hopefully. These strains tend to focus on one type of transformation over another. Is one better for thiol conversion? Another better for esterification? Oof, I am not this person. I don't know all these answers, and I don't know that anyone has all the answers. But Dan, you said you'd like to answer this question live, or?
Well, we answer them live, meaning,
okay.
Yeah, and if
Okay.
it's something that you don't know, we can do a little further research and get back to you.
Well,
But
I mean, you can go to those papers. What the best way to find more information is to take those papers in the references and then see who has referenced those papers recently. And generally every 6 months or so, I try to add on to my knowledge of hops. But now that I'm working in malts and all these other things, I don't get to update as often. But that presentation, I first put all the data together in, I mean, I've been collecting it for years, but I put the majority of it together in February this year, so it's somewhat recent. So I don't know that you're going to find a lot more information on that, but you can try.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time today, Patty. It was a lot of information and a lot of great information too. So really appreciate it. But that's all we have for questions. And as far as any other questions you may have, please feel free to reach out. You can reach us at webinars@bsgcraft.com, and we'll work with Patty and some other people on our team to get those answers for you. And also remember to keep an eye out for new episodes. Those will be announced on social media channels and can be found at bsgcraft.com/webinars. And for any past webinars, please visit YouTube and search BSG Craft, and please subscribe. So from all of us at BSG and RAR, thanks for tuning in. Again, thank you very much, Patty, and we will talk to you soon.